Hello, everyone. This is Jonathan Little. I'm here with the 2015 World Series of Poker Final Table Review. I want to thank all of you for being here today. And if you have any questions, make sure you keep them on topic about the hand we are discussing or the concept we are discussing throughout this webinar. And we'll have a question and answer session at the end so that you can ask any questions that you have. And if you know you're going to have to leave, just write in the question box that it's an off-topic question, and I'll answer it at the end, and you can check it out in the recording. Everyone here will be getting a recording of this entire webinar, so you can watch it whenever you want. So the World Series of Poker Final Table was interesting. There's actually a lot of aggressive action from a lot of the players, which you never really know what to expect whenever you watch the final table, but in particular, the guy who won, McKeon, he played a very aggressive game, but a very controlled aggressive game. Also, a few of the other players were getting out of line and not afraid to take aggressive actions, but as we will see, some of them did it a little bit more optimistically, let's say. Then there were other players who provided a complete lack of action. Some of the players played incredibly fit or fold, which is actually not a bad strategy for the middle stacks. But as we're going to see in just a second, that I don't think that was actually a great strategy given the exact payouts for this tournament. So let's take a look at the payouts real quick. First place is 7.6 million. Obviously, that's a ton of money. But that's actually not what matters at the beginning of the final table. What really matters is what are the initial payout jumps. And as you can see, it goes from 1 million, pretty much 1 million even, to 1.1 million to 1.2 million. So while a lot of people look at this and say, wow, $100,000 payout jump, that's a ton, it's actually not very much, especially given that 10th place got something like 750,000. So the World Series of Poker does this so that everyone at the final table gets $1 million. But what really ends up happening is there's a big payout jump from 10th to 9th. And then there is effectively no payout jumps from 9th to 7th or 9th to even 6th. And even then, it's not like it goes up very much. They've asked, how does the World Series compare, I guess we'll say this final table, compared to the European Poker Tour / Malta, etc., aggression-wise? Well, I mean, I think the good players play roughly equally aggressive, but I feel like there are very few people in Europe who are playing a very fit or fold strategy, and that's just because they play poker very well. We're going to actually see throughout this webinar that this final table actually played out almost like a 2008 World Series of Poker final table or something like that, where most people were just playing somewhat face up. And I don't think that's what you're trying to do at the final table. So we're going to go through a lot of these hands. Very first hand we're going to go over is actually the second hand of the final table. We're going to be using the Share My Pair replayer. Before the cards get dealt, let's take a look at the chip stacks, which are very important. The players involved in this hand are going to be McKeon, who has 62,750. It's worth mentioning right off the bat, I took 3 zeros off of all of the numbers. So the big blinds are actually, or the blinds are actually 200,000, 400,000. But I'm not going to have all these zeros all over the table. I tend to usually do this in my head whenever I'm actually playing poker because it makes things way easier for me. Sometimes it causes misclicks whenever I'm playing online where I want to bet, 4 million, but instead I bet 400,000. That's sometimes a disaster. But in general, I try to make everything as simple as possible. So I cut 3 zeros off of all of the numbers. So let's take a look at the chip stacks. McKeon has 150 big blinds roughly. I'm always working in rough estimates, by the way, too. I'm never like, oh, he has 152.2 big blinds or anything like that. I don't think that is too incredibly relevant. Chan and Buderoni were both the short stacks at the final table. They started with 15 big blinds. The only other 2 short stacks had 30 big blinds, 35 big blinds, Beckley and Canuli. Then we have a bunch of other 40 and 50 big blind stacks, Blumenfield, Stern, Neuville, and Steinberg. So in this situation, whenever McKeon enters the pot and these 2 guys fold, everyone else needs to play somewhat tight, at least traditionally. But if you go back and look at this payout structure, it doesn't really matter if you take 5th place versus 9th place. Again, I realize 1.9 million versus 1 million is a lot, but 1.9 million compared to 7.6 million is a ton. So the payout implications are not quite what they traditionally are. Robert Piper says hello. Welcome. Welcome to everyone who is here tonight. All right, so let's take a look at this the second hand of the tournament. Everyone's going to fold around. And McKeon goes all in. So we have to ask ourselves, what range should McKeon be shoving in this spot? And I initially thought he should be shoving very wide, and that's because I'm used to traditional payout structures. But given this actual payout structure, he can't be shoving too incredibly wide. But he does go all in. So now when he goes all in, which hands should Chan call with? This is hopefully a simulation that all of the players at the final table ran, especially McKeon, Chan, and Buderoni, because they had to see this situation coming. And for that reason, they really need to know the right answer to this problem. If you pick the wrong answer to this problem, you could cost yourself a huge amount of money. So anyway, well, program rewound. Chan does end up calling it off. And Buderoni folds. And then we get to see the hands. And the hands are Ace-4 and King-Queen. And just like that, Chan is out. So I had a few emails about this hand. A lot of people were saying, do you think Chan made a mistake calling it off on the first hand with King-Queen? And whenever I saw this in real time, I'm like, oh, that was probably not a good call. But that's because I was not thinking about the traditional payout. I wasn't thinking about this exact payout structure. I was thinking of a traditional payout structure. And also someone said, would you call off there after 4 months of waiting? And I think that's actually completely irrelevant. So I definitely think that the 4 months you're waiting is not even a factor. Dave said, should Buderoni have called off to take a shot since he's so short? Well, absolutely not. Whenever McKeon shoves and Chan calls, if Buderoni has even something like Ace-9 or something like that, he should certainly fold because he's going to be dominated a lot of the time, and he's guaranteed a free $100,000 if he just folds, which is relevant. So I actually got a program I've been working with called ICMizer, and it tells you what these players should be shoving or folding in this spot, assuming everyone's playing perfectly, which ideally they probably are playing perfectly given they had time to study. I mean, maybe I'm giving people too much credit, but if you have 4 months to study, you better know how to play the spot. All right, so you can actually calculate, you just simply calculate the Nash equilibrium, which is break-even spots for all players. And it says that McKeon should be shoving this range, which is pretty wide. I mean, 7-6 offsuit, 6-4 suited, 5-3 suited, etc. This is roughly 53% of hands. It's saying the hero, Chan, in the small blind should call with 15% of hands. It's not showing for some reason, but pocket sixes are better, Ace-5 suited are better, Ace-8 offsuit are better, King-10 suited are better, and King-Jack offsuit are better. So this actually is a profitable all-in. And then what this also states is that when Chan in the small blind calls, Buderoni should call super tight. And as I just said, I said Ace-9 was an easy fold. It turns out he should actually be very tight in this spot. And that's just because he is guaranteed a free payout jump. And if Chan happened to fold, Buderoni should call off with 21% of hands. So the real question becomes, actually, here we go. Okay, so it says that calling off in this spot is plus 0.09% of the prize pool. So how much is that in real dollars? You can actually click this button up here, go to ICM dollar EV. I think there's roughly $25 million in play at the final table. And by calling here, he makes $23,000, which is acceptable. You're happy making $23,000. So that's a spot where you should probably call it off. Carrie asked where you can get this ICM app. It's actually a paid program that I had to get, but it is called ICMizer. You can get it at icmpoker.com. I'm actually going to make a link at jonathanlittlepoker.com/ICM where you can get it after this video, but I do not have time to get that ready. So jonathanlittlepoker.com/ICM later, but for now, just icmpoker.com. It's also a cool quiz program you can use on this as well, but that's not the point of this webinar. Anyway, so what hands do I think, if I was in this situation, would I be shoving in McKeon's spot? If I was in his shoes, I would actually be shoving almost any two cards, I think, but I don't think I'd be shoving the best hands. Remember, we are playing 15 big blinds deep, so there is room for a raise fold strategy. So I think I would be min raising these best hands, and I also think I'd probably be min raising the absolute trash. So I think my shoving range would be a little bit closer to this. And then I'd be min raising some of the other hands. So maybe I'm min raising a lot of these. Maybe I min raise these as well. So now if this is the range, how does that change things? And now you can go to calculate, and it'll tell you now what Chan should be getting it all in with. Program does take a little bit of time to run the numbers because it is finding you the exactly correct answer. Now you can see King Queen is also a very easy all in, still profiting $84,000. You can also ask what happens if instead of having a very wide shoving range with some min raises, what if he has instead a lot of min raises, right? Maybe McKeon is opting to min raise a lot of his hands that are not great, and then just shove shoving his hands that are good but not so amazing, right? Hands that you don't really want to min raise and have to call off with. You'd much rather just shove yourself. So if that's the case, let's run numbers again. Again, it takes a second or two. We can see that King Queen now is actually only profitable for $3,400, which is actually not very much because, I mean, we're talking about huge amounts of money. Like pocket aces, you win $420,000, right? So you can tell that $3,400 is actually not very much. So it's very important for these players to have a rough estimate of what McKeon's shoving range actually is. And if he has only a shoving range, if he has a small min raising range and a wide shoving range, or a big min raising range, or small min raising range and a big shoving range. You go what I'm saying, those three things. So anyway, that was for the payouts at the World Series final table, but I want to show you that if we have the Sunday Million payouts, just to give you a brief example, notice here ninth is 0.75%. Hope you guys can't hear the sirens outside. 0.75%, 1.2%, 2%. So let's just remember those numbers and go over here. Notice here that it's 4%, 4.4%, 4.8%. So what's happening here is that the payouts are incredibly flat at this moment for whatever reason. And that is certainly worth mentioning. So let's see how this hand would play out in the Sunday Million, given these payouts. Assuming this range, the fairly tight shoving range, you can actually see King Queen as a really easy fold now, which is kind of interesting. You would not expect the King Queen to be a fold too often in this spot. At least I wouldn't. Then let's say shoving the wide range, then min raising some of the other stuff. Take a look at that. David says, given what I saw from McKeon afterwards, I do not think he would go all in with rag hands. He would be min raising those and only be shoving with perceived pre-flop favorite hands versus the blinds. I think he could have been exploitable if he had a betting pattern if Chan had waited. Well, I mean, the thing is that King Queen's great, right? Like, even this is most likely what was going on, or even the tighter one. But notice with the Sunday Million payout, this is still just barely good enough. The real issue that's happening here is that King Queen is great. King Queen's a great hand, and for that reason, I think Chan made a perfectly fine call-off. We saw that even if McKeon's min raising, I mean, the only way this can become really bad is if McKeon is only shoving with actual good hands that are, like say he has a really big min raising range and a very tight jamming range, maybe something like this. This is when it starts to become bad for Chan, but given that this is actually something you have to think about in this scenario. In how many situations is this bad for him? It's only actually bad. Notice here, it's not even that bad, minus 47K. It's only bad whenever McKeon has exactly that strategy. If McKeon has any other strategy, then calling off is very good. So we certainly cannot predict what McKeon's strategy was in this scenario. I mean, I know if they sat me down at this situation, I'm jamming any two cards because even though I know these guys probably had time to study, I'm just not going to bank on it, right? And for that reason, I think that this is a spot where McKeon should be shoving a lot, given these two guys both have the exact same short stack. Phil asked, what does FGS stand for? It stands for Future Game Simulation, sort of an advanced ICM model where it accounts for the future hands that will take place, because imagine you have 3 big blinds under the gun, you should probably play pretty tight, but according to regular ICM. But here, with FGS, Future Game Simulations, it accounts for the fact that you're going to have the big blind next hand and be in a crappy spot. So you should actually be shoving quite wide. It probably doesn't matter too much in this scenario, but I just tend to use it all the time at this point in my life. So anyway, say we weren't going to do this. Say we weren't going to spend all of our time on the first hand. But anyway, I think Chan made a fine call off. Unfortunately, he lost, but I liked his play. I thought it was good. It's the only play that made any sense, really. All right, fast forward a little bit to hand number 12. Notice Buderoni is now very short at 10 big blinds. McKeon still has a lot. So this is a spot where I think Buderoni should be shoving a lot of hands. We're not going to use the ICM calculator too often in this final table, but whenever the payout structure is very flat, like it was, the guy with the short stack really wants to get off the short stack so he can actually play a little bit of poker. So he should be shoving a very wide range in this scenario. If he did shove, Blumenfield should probably call with the A7, but seeing how Buderoni's not shoving very much, maybe he shouldn't. All right, so anyway, Blumenfield min raises. Let's just make sure we saw that right. Yeah, so Blumenfield makes it 900 at 200, 400. Again, we're just going to use these numbers instead of the 200,000, 400,000. And then Stern decides to 3-bet. Stern was one of the players who was taking very aggressive actions in situations like this. I think it's actually a very strong play, and it's going to put Blumenfield in a tough spot with a lot of his range. But then Blumenfield takes the really aggressive line and 4-bets. And I actually don't mind this. I think if you're going to raise small from the small blind, you need to have the ability to 4-bet in your range. And I think this is actually a pretty good play. What do I think about Stern's King 2 offsuit 3-bet? I think it's probably fine as well. Hands like King X and Queen X and Jack X are really not very good calling hands. And for that reason, you often want to turn them into 3-bets. I do want to point out that I don't really like Blumenfield's raise to 900 preflop, because what's going to happen is Stern's going to call every time, or call or re-raise every time. He's not going to have much of a folding range unless it's just absolute trash. And you really do want to make your opponents fold whenever you are out of position, especially when they have more chips than you. That being said, I think I might implement a limping strategy from the small blind, given Buderoni has no chips. Remember, Buderoni has 10 big blinds, so you really don't want to go broke in Blumenfield's spot. So I think I'd be a little bit cautious in this scenario, given we know Stern's aggressive from watching him leading up to the final table. And he's going to play pretty well, most likely. So I don't really like the small raise. I think I'd much rather limp or raise larger. He does like the 4-bet, which looks super strong. And you really have to ask yourself, is Stern going to blast you? And if Stern decides to have a lot of courage, he could go all in this spot, and it would be pretty sweet because, again, given the payout implications, Blumenfield really doesn't want to go broke, given that a lot of the players have fewer chips than he does. But Stern decides to release it, and Blumenfield picks up a nice pot. And I think this was one of these games of chicken, right, where you know that both players are probably somewhat weak, but usually the player with the biggest stack in this scenario has the advantage because they can be the one to put in the last bet and put their opponent in a horrible spot. So I would definitely take notes on this kind of thing from Blumenfield, that maybe he doesn't care so much about the payout implications, or at least he's not really aware that he can be getting abused by Stern. But it's a cool spot. I think that this is a scenario where both players did nothing wrong, but I think if I was in Blumenfield's spot, I probably would have implemented a limping strategy. Actually, a lot of spots for a limping strategy in this final table, which is kind of neat. You don't really see that too often. But we'll get to those as we progress forward. David says, once Blumenfield 4-bet bluff was known by the other players after the delay caught up. Okay. If you were in Blumenfield's position, what adjustments do you make knowing the other players would know that would happen? Well, I mean, I think I'd probably just keep doing my thing. I mean, they're going to recognize you're playing a lot of hands at that point. But I'd probably tighten up a little bit. I mean, you certainly don't want to be running too many 4-bet bluffs. I don't think that's where you want to be as the middle stack. I mean, obviously it gets you closer to the big stack, but even then you're still so far away. So I don't know. I don't think I would adjust too much. I recognize that everyone can see everyone's cards after 30 minutes, but unless you do something blatantly insane, I don't think it's going to be too exploitable, right? And in that scenario, Blumenfield's 4-bet was perfectly fine, given that his range to raise from the small blind preflop is probably strong to start with. And if he's raising, he does need to have some 4-bets in his range. That's just how poker happens. And so I'm fine with that. I don't really have an issue with that play. And I don't think he needs to change it up in the future. All right, next hand. All right, so this is one of the hands where I do think a limping strategy could easily come into play. Here, Steinberg has pocket eights, right? He has aggressive McKeehan on his left. Canuli has 30 big blinds, or 22 big blinds now, and Buderoni's very short. So take a look at what happens this hand. This is actually a pretty big disaster for Steinberg. He raises, and McKeon decides to use the big stack to apply pressure. So what happens now, right? Does Steinberg really want to call out of position and see a flop with pocket eights? It's not really where you want to be. Does he want to jam? Jamming's pretty risky because if McKeon just has a good hand, you're out. It's a pretty rough spot. And so now Steinberg has to ask, what is the best play? I think if I was in his shoes, I would have went all in. I know that seems somewhat aggressive, but again, notice there are 8 players at the table. And remember the payouts, they were very flat at this point. So you're not really concerned with moving up the payouts, or at least you shouldn't be. And this is a good way to let McKeon know that I'm not the guy you're going to be 3-betting today. Because you really don't want to be known as the guy who's going to fold to a lot of 3-betting pressure. And I think, given the way the tournament played out leading up to the final table, Steinberg should have known that McKeon is going to be abusing the spot. I mean, McKeon seemed to play like a good online kid. You know, he didn't seem to do anything too ridiculous, and I thought he played well. And knowing that, you have to become prepared knowing that when you raise, you're going to get 3-bet. So if you know you're going to be getting 3-bet, you really can't fold pocket eights. I think that's somewhat of a disaster. So what happens? Steinberg actually does fold. And I think that was a very large error. So the way you avoid this spot is you limp. Imagine what happens instead is you limp here, Canuli folds, Steinberg or McKeon then raises to like 2.75 or 3 or 4 big blinds, whatever. You can then easily call, see a flop, and play from there. And unless McKeon really wants to just blast off with his whole range, you're going to be able to realize your equity a decent amount of the time. And whenever you have a pretty good hand, the name of the game is just realizing your equity and not getting blown off your hand. And by raising, you set yourself up to get blown off your hand. David says, do you think a decent 4-bet would work to get McKeon to fold, or must be all-in situation? Well, so in this scenario, it goes 1,200, 2,800. If I'm in Steinberg's shoes, I think I'm actually shoving. And I understand that is very large. It's a large shove. It is about 7 times his initial, or his re-raise. But you don't want to re-raise to something like 6,200 because then McKeon may just decide, all right, I'm all in. And you're going to have to fold at that point. So, I mean, you really don't want to put in even more chips and fold. That's sort of the definition of a disaster in this spot, is investing a lot of chips and then just getting no equity whatsoever. So I think I'm jamming in this spot if I'm going to raise. But I do think limping is probably the best play with this stack size and this table setup, which is usually not the ideal play. But Steinberg actually had one of the ideal spots for this, where once I mean, he has McKeon and Blumenfield in his blinds and in late position throughout the final table. And it really does put him in a crappy spot. And whenever you're in that spot, you have to recognize that raising, getting 3-bet is really not what you want to happen. Chris says, you understand that the jam is probably the best play, but do you think folding here would be better than calling and playing out of position versus the big stack? No, I think calling's definitely better than folding. I mean, your hand's great. I think a lot of people don't realize how great pocket eights is. Your hand is fantastic. You can easily check call a lot of flops and then go from there. I do agree it's a tough spot, and I think raising puts you in that tough spot. Dave said the small stack might have played into his decision. Well, yeah, of course it did. I mean, that's the only factor that actually is relevant. Otherwise, Steinberg for sure would have just played his hand for full value. The reason he folds here is because he doesn't want to go broke before the 3,200 stack. I mean, that should be very, very clear. Dan says, should Steinberg assume that McKeon will be overly aggressive against him based on the stack sizes? Absolutely. I think that is something he should definitely take into account. It's incredibly relevant. And I think that it was probably a pretty big mistake to not get it in the spot. Actually, while we're here, I don't really have a ton of experience on this program, but we can try to run the stats for right here real quick. So we're in the hijack seat. Here's in hijack. We raise to 1,200. Have to create new blinds. Okay. So we are 8-handed. Big blind, I believe, was actually sitting out. How do we do this then? Or small blind was sitting out because I think he had... I don't know exactly what happened here. I'm kind of confused. Let's say the 3,200 or the 4,000 stack was in the big blind. So let's give him 3,600. Let's give this guy... I'm just going to do this really roughly. 3.2 million. Hero has 2,000 to start. So roughly the same. This guy has 20,000. We'll give all these guys the same stacks. All right, so let's do something like this. And hero raises to 1,200. Okay. I don't know if I can figure out how to make this guy 3-bet, though. Maybe I'm wasting time here. Oh, I think we have to give this guy the initial 3-betting range. I don't know. I don't know how to do this at this second. I'm sorry, guys. There is a way to go through there and do that where you can figure it out, but I pretty much promise you Steinberg needs to be shoving. Sorry for the sorry for the waste of time. I'm the worst. Anyway, I think that's the spot where Steinberg just has to get it in or start a limping strategy. I'm certainly not a pro with that ICM calculator. I'm very new to it. I used to use one a long time ago whenever I first started playing sit and goes, but haven't really used one in a long time. Here's another interesting hand where Blumenfield and Stern were getting after it. Both these players were fairly aggressive. Again, I would have just folded this pretty much every time in this scenario. If I was in Blumenfield's shoes, I do not think that it is necessary to play 8-2 suited. I mean, what do you guys think? Are you ever playing 8-2 suited in the spot? Again, we have to remember Buderoni's sitting here with no chips. I mean, you really just don't want to play in position against a guy who you already know can 3-bet with a wide range. I think that's going to put you in a bad spot. Then Stern decides, you know what, I'll defend. I think this is also probably a little bit too loose. I do think that a lot of the players did not defend their blinds nearly enough in this tournament. But at the same time, 9-2 suited is pretty bad. So they get sort of a dream flop here. We have a flush draw plus top pair. And Blumenfield bets 1,500 into the 2,800 chip pot. And I think this is fine. It's pretty standard stuff. And then Stern calls. I think calling is the only play that makes too much sense. Turns of 5 of spades give Blumenfield a draw. I would definitely continue betting in this spot. And Stern calls again. I'm also fine with the call. Again, you don't want to raise because you're only going to get called when you're beat or whenever Blumenfield has a great draw, which he happens to. So now you have to ask yourself, going to the river, which rivers should Blumenfield bluff? Obviously, he's going to bet whenever he gets a straight, whenever he gets a flush. Should he be betting the overcards? And I don't really think that he needs to be betting I guess he should probably be betting a 6 and a 7. I think those are probably good cards to bluff. An 8 gives him a pair, so you definitely want to check that. What about a 10, Jack, King, Queen, Ace? I think those could all well, an ace gives you a straight. I think that the overcards are probably good rivers to bluff. I imagine Stern should have a lot of marginal pairs in his range when he calls here on the flop and the turn. And I think those the big card rivers are going to be very scary for most of Stern's range. So I probably would bet on a lot of those rivers. And I'd bet somewhat large, maybe 8,000 into the 12,000 pot. So that's my plan in Blumenfield's shoes. Dave says, can Stern put pressure on because he's open-ended? Well, you have to realize Stern has a good bluff catcher right now. He's not really concerned with his drawing equity. He's more so concerned with the fact that I probably have the best hand. And if he has the best hand, but say Blumenfield bets turn and Stern raises, now Blumenfield's only going to call if he has a good top pair, which Stern loses to, or a good draw, which Stern is just slightly ahead of. So for that reason, I definitely think that Stern cannot raise. I mean, his hand is basically top pair bad kicker. He's not trying to blast money in with a bad draw. I think that's definitely not what he wants to do. So I think calling's the only play that makes sense for that. David says, you think a pot-sized bet on the turn gets Stern to fold, or a check raise on the turn gets Stern to fold? Well, I mean, Stern's never folding top pair and a straight draw blind versus blind. I mean, that's just never happening. I mean, maybe you could check raise. I don't know. I really don't have a whole lot of turn check raises in this spot from out of position. It's a very optimistic play. And again, there's a big overriding factor here that Buderoni has 3,000 chips. It's 8 big blinds or so. So I don't think these guys want to play a big pot here. I think they just want to not go broke. And I like Blumenfield pushing the action, but I really don't think you want to bet big in this spot, because if Stern has a 4, he could just easily fold to the turn bet, or a 3. And if he has a 9, he's not folding to any bets. So I don't think there's any purpose in really getting after it. So river's a 2, gives Blumenfield a pair. Should he bet this river? Well, he probably has no showdown value. That's worth mentioning. He does beat the random king, queen of hearts, but that's probably going to bluff you on the river if you check. So I actually could see bluffing this. This is sort of like a 6 coming on the river. I do think Blumenfield could easily have the ace. He did raise pre-flop. The real question here is, will Stern fold a 9? I think if you can make Stern fold a 9, you should definitely bluff. But I'm not counting on guys folding top pair blind versus blind. So I could easily see checking being fine. I could see betting being fine. I think the real issue here is that if you check and your opponent bets, you just lose every time. And you could conceivably have the best hand, so you may get bluffed some percentage of the time if you check. So I think I would probably bet this. And I would bet, again, somewhat large, maybe 8,000 to the 12,000 pot. Notice if you lose, you still have 30 big blinds, which is fine. And if you win, that's great. You go up to 32,000 chips, which is fantastic. So I do think this is one of the bluff cards. It's kind of unfortunate that you rivered a pair and the board didn't get super scary or anything, but I would probably go for it here. Blumenfield thought forever and then checked. Stern checked, and Stern wins the pot. I do think this is a very easy check behind with 2 pair on the river, because if you bet, you're only going to get called by a straight for the most part, or a better 2 pair. So well played by Stern, I think, besides the pre-flop call. I think his calls on the flop and turn and then check on the river were great. And his call pre-flop in position is probably not horrible, but I really do not think that it's necessary to run this play. You know, just defending 9-2 suited, it's just not a very good hand. John asks, if the turn was an 8, should Blumenfield check call? Well, he's going to check the river for sure. And should he check call? It's a tough one. Certainly a tough one. Because, I mean, so yeah, you're talking about on the river, if the river was an 8, giving him middle pair. I would check. I mean, the problem is you have 2 hearts as blockers to make it harder for your opponents to have hearts. Yeah, I don't know. That'd definitely be a tough one. I do not know the answer to that one. That would be a very difficult spot. I would probably call, but I could easily see folding being the right play. And if an 8 did come on the river and Blumenfield checked, Stern probably should put in a value bet at that point. So that would be a nasty spot. Phil says, do you think Blumenfield's coaches told him to go after Stern? Well, you should very rarely be going after the guy who has position on you. So I think it'd be a pretty bad idea to tell your student to go after the guy who has position on you. I think that'd be a pretty big disaster. So I would hope they wouldn't say that. Seems like not a very good idea, but maybe they did. Who knows? You have to realize that whenever a guy has position on you, you are going to lose to that guy, even if he's not a very good poker player, because he has position. Just having position and being competent is enough to make a competent player versus a world-class player a favorite. So you win money from the guys on your right. And unfortunately, Blumenfield has the chip leader on his right. So if I was in Blumenfield's shoes, I just would have buckled up, called McKeon's raises a lot, and then made a pair and then not folded. I think that's going to be his best strategy for the final table. John said, did the players know the seats beforehand? They did. So they had all of this information that we started with.